The Conquest of Bliss, a podcast about finding light in the darkness. This episode was produced by Kabby Productions. Today's episode is brought to you by the musical stylings of After Dark. They have fantastic music. It always reminds me of pop music from the 90s in the best way. It's so comforting and wonderful. And I happen to know the artists. And they have been very supportive and are sponsoring today's show. And I couldn't appreciate them more. So go to Spotify, look up After Dark. It'll be the one that has the song Colors and Breakaway. And oh my goodness, they're just so fantastic. I'm so excited for you to hear them. So big thank you to After Dark, and here we go. Hello and welcome back to the Conquest of Bliss. I am, of course, Kara Fernstrom, and I am here once again with Dr. Yohan John. And how are you today, Dr. Yohan?
I'm doing very well, Kara. How are you?
I'm fantastic. I'm so excited to have this conversation. So we're going to be talking about a super useful tool in helping us to understand things better, and also a tool that's very useful in expanding our knowledge. So it's a tool you heard about in English class. So do you want to get us started and let us know what that tool is?
The tool is metaphor and sort of more broadly analogical thinking. It's, like you said, something that comes up in English class. And I still distinctly remember in 6th or 7th grade being taught about metaphor in the context of a poem. I think it was like, "The road was a ribbon of moonlight" was the line. In fact, I still remember it. And when you're introduced to it, it seems like some sort of decoration. Mm-hmm. But it goes quite deeply into how humans think. And there is an argument to be made that we always think analogically, even when we think we're speaking literally.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And so before we go into how the tool works, because I always love a good story, how did you? I know you talked about it a little bit on the last episode you were on, but how did you open up to the fact that it's not just a linguistic decorative flourishment? Like, how did that come into your knowledge?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know when I started getting interested in this, because I definitely enjoyed the English class. And I think around the same age, maybe I was introduced to Joseph Campbell, who was an expert on mythology. And he was very interested in looking at mythology and understanding symbolic meanings. So the psychological understanding of things. And I immediately sort of resonated with that approach to mythology in general. And, I brought up Christian, I'm Christian, and reading even Christian stories in that way. But then I would talk about this sort of symbolic reading with people, and they wouldn't necessarily follow what I was talking about. So, and then on the other hand, you have within science, there's a lot of analogy making to teach a scientific idea. Mm-hmm. And then as I kind of got into the history of science, I realized that without an analogy, you're kind of lost, because scientists are talking about and studying things that no one has really fully understood. So their toolbox consists of old ideas, mm-hmm. old images, memories, things like that. And so it's like taking a shape that you know and trying to fit it onto a shape that you're trying to understand.
Yeah, and that totally, yes. As soon as so I read an article that you'd sent me that you'd written in 2012, and I read that article, and I was like, oh my gosh, yes. So can you talk a little bit, just so that everybody has a full understanding and we can use the terms as we go, what the parts of a metaphor are, how that works?
Okay. So in that essay, I used some terminology from a really wild and interesting book called The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And that you have to take the whole book with a pinch of salt. But what's interesting about it is that in the course of the book, there's all kinds of interesting little tools and little ideas that the author, Julian Jaynes, gives the reader. So you can use the tools even if you don't believe the overall thesis of the book. And one of them was, let's ask what a metaphor is and how human beings started thinking metaphorically. So in the book, he asks, but if you think about it, people long before any sort of biology existed would attribute abstract features to the body.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, you might say the chest is the container of courage.
Mm-hmm.
Or when people say someone is yellow-bellied, that's something to do with the belly being connected to fear or cowardice. And so how did they start doing this? And the way he said it was the human body became a metaphorical container for abstract attributes of a person's personality. So in order to kind of get into that, he explains what a metaphor is. Now, I know I wrote this essay, but I keep forgetting the terms, the exact terms.
Well, I know metaphor was one of them.
Yes, so you have the metaphile and the metaphrand.
Okay.
So one of them is the thing that you're familiar with, that you're using to understand the less familiar thing. So I believe the metaphrand is what you'd like to understand, and the metaphile is what you're using to understand.
Yeah.
So in the case of the road was a ribbon of moonlight, let's say that I'm trying to describe the road. That's my metaphrand, the thing I'm targeting. And moonlight then, or ribbon, is the metaphile. It's giving me some way of shedding light on what the moon is, what the road was like on that particular day. So along with that initial kind of mapping, saying, well, this is like that, there's all these sort of additional associations. Sometimes they're just subconscious. So you have the pataphile and pataphrand, I think, is the term, were the terms that he used. But basically, so we can shift to a different example here. The one I used in the essay was ideas as food. Yes. So you can, when you think about, you literally say that you're digesting an idea, or chewing over an idea, or digesting a book, right? So once you sort of put this idea out there, other ideas kind of come along for free. So as soon as you say that digesting is related to understanding, you think, well, what's the stomach? And then you say, okay, and then that bounces you back to the world of reading, and you say, oh, maybe it's the brain, or specifically the part of the brain involved in reading. And then you can say, well, what's junk food? And what's a salad? Mm-hmm. So there may be some forms of reading that are good for you, and others that are like making you less than healthy.
Mm-hmm, or
and so you can keep, so it's like as if the seed of the initial metaphor can kind of grow into this bush of all kinds of different associations that you may not initially even have thought of. There's this term that you come across on the internet sometimes, overthinking it. And I've always disliked this term, because as long as you're not, hurting anybody, overthinking is fun, right? And so making an extended metaphor, a wild analogy, is a lot of fun. It can be quite ridiculous. Like if you try to write one of these things down, eventually you'll start to say things that aren't really true, or you're stretching the analogy. But it's always good to push an analogy as far as it can go, all the way to breaking point.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I really liked in the thing, is that in the article is that you talked about, is that you can leave an analogy where it is, or a metaphor where it is, or you can see how far it can go, right? And what was cool as I was reading this is that I'm a huge fan of metaphors. I've never dug deep into how they work, but I've always associated much better and learned much better and explained things much better using metaphor. And I've run into that where, so I wasn't really aware of what I was doing. And I've run into that where, I'm talking and everything's lining up perfectly. And then all of a sudden I say something and I'm like, wait, that doesn't make any sense,
Yeah.
And it's kind of a beautiful thing.
Yeah. In fact, it's a good way to think about how, as with any tool, you got to know its limitations. Like, a hammer is useful for banging in nails and for opening cans of paint, but there are limits to what it can do. If you want to screw something in, the hammer might not be the right choice. So any specific metaphor, you have to know that it has limits, which is why, maybe I don't say it in that essay, but one thing I've been also thinking about is how to kind of deeply understand something, if you can cycle among different metaphors, you kind of destabilize being hung up on any one image for too long. And in one sense, that's the road to abstract thinking, is to look at one metaphor, then look at a different metaphor. And the more analogies you can sort of lay out there, the more you're kind of getting at the essence of the thing that is drawing your attention.
Yeah, it's a bit of like it's almost more complete because you can sort of see different sides of it, and you can see where it ceases to be like this other thing.
Exactly.
And for anyone that's curious, I don't know if anyone's as much of a nerd as me, but simile is similar to metaphor, but it just uses like or as to compare instead of just saying it's the same. So I always wondered that when I was a kid, and then I learned it and I got really excited, and then people ask me.
Right, they make a big deal out of it when you're in middle school and high school, but which is why I like to just fold everything into analogy. Now, there are people who quibble and say that, well, analogy is slightly different, and because sometimes a metaphor doesn't sort of lay out kind of in a systematic way what is what. Because if I'm saying reading is like digestion, I'm kind of doing something less literary and more like a table. I'm like, okay, the book is the food, the brain is the stomach, this is the this, and there's like, you can go one by one through the columns on two sides of a table. But the style of thinking is similar. So you could say that metaphor is like implicit analogy. And simile is just drawing attention to the fact that you're doing that. The effect it has on the reader is quite interesting, because when you don't say X is like Y, then you're kind of, it produces an effect. I don't know how quite to describe it, but it's definitely an effect.
Well, I think it's almost more fantastical. Like it engages a part of your brain that's more, like I said, fantastical seems like the right word, where, you can say her eyes shone like stars, or her eyes were stars. And her eyes shone like stars is definitely a compliment, but her eyes were stars is sort of consuming. It pulls you in. It makes you, it forces you to think, which I think is part of it. And so just because I am quite sure that you're more educated about this subject than me, so I'll just ask. So allegory and parables would also fall into analogy, right?
Yes. With parables, especially, sometimes it's hard to work out what the allegory is sometimes, but especially if it hasn't been fully explained. But yes, so you could say that you could almost think of it in terms of length. A metaphor could even be just a little phrase.
Yeah. An
analogy might require a couple of lines. And an allegory is often a story. And then you can have entire works that have multiple readings, and that some readers are reading only the literal level of the narrative, and other readers are seeing one or two or many symbolic resonances.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I'm pretty sure we probably don't know, because it's one thing that I definitely learned from our last one is it's amazing how much we're still learning, and we still have to learn. But do we have any information since 2012 about what's happening in our brains when we're using metaphor?
This is an excellent question, and I confess I haven't looked for neuroscience studies lately. It's not my exact topic, but the reason I'm somewhat skeptical, I mean, there may be an fMRI researcher out there, and if they happen to be listening to this, please send me your paper. But that shows that when someone is asked to look at SAT, GRE style analogies in an fMRI scanner, in an MRI scanner, then certain parts of the brain light up. And there's reason, like if I were to do that experiment, I would guess before doing it that you would see language areas light up, but also potentially areas related to the specific activities. Like if someone is saying tennis is like war, and if someone were to identify slightly different brain areas that are to do with war versus tennis, maybe both of them would become slightly more active than otherwise. And this relates to a general idea that's quite popular in neuroscience called embodied cognition. So it's like when we're thinking about something, we're sort of using the parts of the brain that are involved when we're perceiving that thing. So there's a basis in there for kind of blurring the literal versus the metaphorical. So when we're actually looking at a tennis match versus thinking about how something else is like tennis, similar brain areas seem to be involved.
That's amazing. So basically like a complicated version of like placebo, how placebo works, the belief sort of makes it like it's actually happening in the brain.
Well, placebo effect also, we don't really know exactly how it works.
Fair.
But yeah, the idea is that you're sort of reusing something that has is in one context in a slightly different context. And we don't really know what the purpose is or how it evolved necessarily, but we could say that patterns that you learn in one domain might turn out to be useful in another. And that, so even implicitly, without knowing that we're doing it, we might, like when someone's explaining something to you, you might not be explicitly saying, let me think of an analogy. But it just so happens that something from your domain of experience or expertise suddenly crops up almost on its own.
Yeah, this is very familiar.
yes, yeah. Or, I read a book where that sort of thing happened.
So
yeah,
that's incredible. This is okay. So when people like one of the cool things about this conversation to me and about reading that article and stuff like that, and you even mentioned it in the article, is that a lot of people view allegorical thinking or analogical. How's the word?
Yes.
Okay. Analogical thinking as sort of superfluous, sort of silly, not grounded in whatever the term of the day is that means, like, tough and smart and straight edged. Can you speak to a little bit of that in the scientific community and why that, would be hopefully changed soon? Because I know it's popular in pop science. But yeah. So one way to kind of maybe set this up is there's an idea that's popular in a lot of scientific fields, that all models are false, but some are useful. So people often say this, that basically when you make some sort of mathematical model of something, or even a physical model, like a little Lego version of something, that's not capturing all of reality. But at the same time, people believe that there exists out there, perhaps in some future, the perfect model that captures all details of reality. I don't think such a thing is possible or even meaningful. Mm-hmm. The whole reason that we use theories and models is to simplify reality. And the nature of simplification is to throw away details. Well, sorry, I just have a question.
There's an element of, which details you throw away matters, which is why it may not be the case that one model is always useful. Mm-hmm. You may need to use a slightly different model depending on what it is you want to do. If you are a surgeon, you might need to look at the brain in one way. But if you're thinking about how the brain works, you might need a slightly different perspective in addition to what the surgeon knows. So there are different models that you use.
Yeah, that was basically what my question was when the ultimate model ultimately limit us, because then we believe that we know all there is to know and we stop searching.
Right. And so there's a joke. There's a paper that from two famous people who founded cybernetics, Norbert Wiener and Arturo Rosenbluth, and they wrote that the best material model of a cat is another, or preferably the same cat. Now, what's the point of learning about a cat using another cat? Mm-hmm. It sounds silly, but we're getting to this point with really, really complicated models, like you've heard of machine learning and artificial neural networks probably. And one issue is that when they work, we don't always understand why they work. So what we have, and it almost sounds like something from a parody or a short story, but now we have research into the models about to look at why they work. And people are using some of the methods that people are using for the brain to understand things that they themselves made.
Oh my goodness.
What if I knock out this bit of the artificial network? What happens? That's analogous to when people use lesions. They break something in the brain and see what happens. So the more complicated your models get, the more they themselves become things that need to be understood. But just to link this back to analogy, when people are confronted with metaphors and analogies, because of this idea that they're literary or decorative, they think, well, I would like to know the literal truth. And it's true that some analogies, you very quickly come to where the analogy fails. Mm-hmm. Like, for instance, if you say that an atom is like the solar system, with the nucleus in the middle and the electrons revolving around them like planets, that's like an okay start. But the solar system is kind of flat, whereas the atom has a very complicated structure, and electrons are not little point masses. They're probabilistic and weird. No one really knows what to say about them. You have to be aware that when you're offering an analogy, it only takes you so far. Mm-hmm. And I think physicists in particular are very good at taking everything they say with a pinch of salt, and mathematicians too. It's like, well, we'll use these analogies, but quickly drop them. Mm-hmm. And I think in fields that maybe are not so mathematical, The feeling, there's a little bit of fear of analogies. It's like, oh no, what if I get stuck with like the selfish gene metaphor? It's a metaphor, and Richard Dawkins says so in the book. But in that particular context, the fact that the word selfish is so prominent in there, people say, well, we don't like this metaphor because of the pacifiers, like the other things that kind of ride along with this metaphor, which maybe were not intended in the original design of that metaphor. It's like, well, if genes are selfish, should people be selfish too? Or is it the case that any kind of altruism is actually a form of selfishness? You may not want those kinds of associations. And so people have tried to speak in very abstract, dry, image-free kind of language. Yeah. And that was very popular in the middle of the 20th century. We're kind of waking up from that period at the moment.
Well, and I mean, the thing that a lot of people, I can't remember if you mentioned this specifically, but the unfortunate side effect of that is a rift, an inaccessibility for a lot of people. Because if you haven't studied the entire, like if I haven't studied neuroscience, I'm not going to understand what you're talking about. If you don't talk in some sort of metaphors, like make it relatable in some way, like I have a vague idea of like what synapses are, but that's more or less the end of it. Like I've heard of the amygdala and stuff, but I don't know what any of it means without metaphor.
Exactly. And there's the sort of dirty secret of a lot of scientists is that they'll use lots of metaphors while talking to each other or in private or while thinking. And then they'll kind of remove them by the time they get to the stage of publication. And then it's the job of a separate group of writers, like the journalists and the pop scientists, to add some metaphors back again. It's not always the case. Some scientists are good about putting the metaphors in there. But this is a problem because then they'll complain, that the pop scientists don't get it. The pop writers are misleading people. But it's in the nature of simplifications that they'll be misleading in some direction or the other. Mm-hmm. So it's better to kind of use the metaphors and always remind people of where they break down. Because abstract language, and this is a fun twist, which many people will probably disagree with, but a lot of abstract language that's trying to be hyper-specific is itself metaphorical. People just don't realize it. Mm-hmm. And the simplest way to think about that is that when I categorize something, when I say all these different things, like a Chihuahua and a Great Dane are dogs, right? What exactly am I saying here? Like, what is dog in the abstract? Like, if someone from a different planet were to land all of a sudden and be shown a Chihuahua and Great Dane, would they realize that they're the same species? Yeah. So what's happening here? That we're saying that certain features are common between them, and in this case, there's a genealogical history. We know that they descended from wolves, but in other situations, it's more complicated. Like when we use an abstract process, when we say something revolves around something else. Ooh. What does it mean to revolve around something else?
It means to go in
the only way I can explain it is with specific examples. So all of those, like you could say, well, the essence of it isn't bolted to any of the examples, but in order to understand it, you have to start somewhere.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of leads to sort of my next question is, if someone wants to use use metaphor, I mean, obviously now we know that science often uses metaphor and just sort of keeps it behind closed doors, which I get, especially with the sciences, like you said, that are less mathematical. They're already fighting the terms like soft sciences, which is a metaphor as well. But using, fighting these terms and just, wanting to prove validation. And so the second they use something that might appear as fluff, then people might, so I get that. And I think that that's, great for people to know, because if the scientists are using it, then it's probably okay if you use it too. So the next question is how does metaphor help us learn, and what can we use it for? As far as, because you talked a little bit about not only does it help us understand, but also that it can further our knowledge. So can you just talk a little bit on that piece? Because it's really cool. It's really cool.
Yeah, I think what is understanding, right? Like the origins of that term come from not so much standing underneath something as standing inside something. So under, there's a word it's related to in Hindi and Sanskrit, antar, which means inside. So to understand something is to kind of stand inside it, to kind of almost like take its perspective. There's different forms of understanding and different kind of standards or criteria by which people decide that they've understood something. Like sometimes you just want to hear a story, and then if the story sounds plausible to you, you say you understood. But if you're an engineer, that's not necessarily sufficient. You want to be able to control the thing that you've been just told about. If someone says, I made this new cool material, let me tell you a story about it. The engineer is like, whatever, just tell me how I can use it.
Yeah.
Story is great, but I want to know. And in science and philosophy, if you like look carefully, you'll see that some people, when they ask for an explanation, what they want is a narrative. It might be called a causal narrative, but that causal narrative is not always useful. Like, for instance, knowing how the universe was formed, not exactly going to give me a technology I can use tomorrow, right?
Yes.
Knowing about the Big Bang, what exactly am I going to do with that?
Yes.
So understanding is in the eye of the beholder to some extent. And what metaphor does is, it does two things, one of which is not necessarily good. Like, if you shop around for the metaphor that suits you, it might actually prevent you from investigating further. If you're like, oh, I get this. This is just like the thing that I'm already familiar with. That's bad because it kind of kills curiosity. Mm-hmm. But if you use it well, it's like saying, well, there's this big baffling thing here. I need a way in. And then the metaphor is like a gateway to say, oh, you don't have to learn everything afresh. You're not a baby here. There are certain things that you understand intuitively even that you can import when you're entering this domain. And so the metaphor, if you are sensitive to those pacifiers, to those additional associations that sort of radiate outwards, you might come up with something, or you might, basically almost join in the process of discovery, even if it's just for yourself. It's like people talk about reinventing the wheel, but sometimes it's good to reinvent the wheel. Like, you kind of learn how wheels are made, and so. If you have an analogy, you can read up on something and then think, well, if that's true, maybe this is also true. And then you can check. Now on the internet, you can just Google and say, is it the case that X means Y? So you can kind of get a window into scientific thinking. So the metaphors can open your horizons outwards.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I like the idea that you follow it to where it stops making sense, and then maybe you grab another metaphor, or maybe you explore, the differences. I think is another great way to do it, is go, oh, the moon is no longer like cheese in this case. So what is it like, and sort of use that as a place to explore. I think it was a really, you said jumping off point or something similar to that. And I think that's or use a gateway. Same idea though, right? It puts you in a position to start understanding, because without a starting, I'm for some reason I'm thinking of graph paper, and you're trying to draw a graph, but if you don't have an original point to start with, you have no idea what that graph is supposed to look like, right? Mm-hmm. So that's so fascinating, and I guess that's a metaphor too. I didn't even mean to do that. So the other thing too is I think that one thing is about communication, and I really liked when you said, but that it's not as helpful to lean into the metaphor that suits you best. And I think that it's also helpful to understand the other kind of possible issue with that is, if you're trying to communicate and you're going beyond just trying to learn for yourself, sometimes the metaphor that suits you best isn't going to be something that's well understood by the other party, right?
Exactly. And it can also color your way of approaching something. Like, for instance, if you either consciously or unconsciously treat every discussion as a war, or then the metaphor of wars involve attacks and counter thrusts, and there's all these kinds of words people use, for instance, in academic debates. So that can color how you frame things, and can even influence your emotions, because you're thinking in terms of winning and losing, and all of those kinds of things that come along with the war metaphor. However, if it would be much cooler if people thought about debates as a jazz improvisation, where each person gets to have a solo, but also they're trying to set up rhythms for the other person. So it can change how you approach social interactions.
Yeah, that's a great point. And as you started talking about war, my thought immediately went to a lot of people, for whatever reason, come to me for relationship advice. And one of the things that I always tell people is stop making your partner the enemy, right? So many people are like, I'm going to win this relationship, or I'm going to win this, win this fight even. And it's like, well, I mean, a one fight is one where nobody wins, right? And so like, I think that that's a really interesting point, is that how shifting the metaphors, the ways that we relate to the world, make a huge impact on what decisions we make going forward. Are we trying to win, or are we trying to build a beautiful jazz? Or are we, trying to build a life, which again, another metaphor. Holy crap, there's so many metaphors. Yep. But trying to build a life together, and then you're a team, and every win for your partner is a win for you.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, that's fantastic. I know I get really giddy. I get like this about anything to do with like language stuff and how that works. So the question, okay. What can we do if we don't know kind of how to start, where to find a metaphor? I know that doesn't come as naturally to everyone. Any ideas on like sort of backward or reverse engineering how metaphor works so that people can sort of get there if they need it or want it?
That's interesting. I don't know that I have any recipes, but one thing that could be fun, I don't know whether I've tried it, but maybe I subconsciously do this, is kind of take anything you're interested in and compare it to anything else that you happen to like. You can all, like, the crazy thing about the human mind is how you can pick any two things, however unrelated they are, and compare them. You can pick a galaxy and an ant. And so like you could almost like make games out of this, which is like you could put a bunch of words in a hat, and then players pick two words out, and they have to say in what way are they similar and in what way are they not similar. The not similar part is easier, so you have to kind of make sure that the similar thing comes first. And that kind of exercises your analogy metaphor muscles.
Yeah. And that could be like a fun party game. Maybe I'm boring because I think that'd be a fun party game. And yeah, like I think that's great advice, because play, and this is a little bit off topic, but play is one of the most functional learning tools that I've come across. Is, like my brain, at least, I can't speak to other people's, but like my brain, my mind does not like try. It does not like trying to, like, when I force it to learn something, I'm like, I need to know this information, but when it's a game, when you play, it becomes exciting. You become engaged. You want to be better at it. So
in fact, there's another kind of dimension where the sheer power of human analogy making is pretty evident. It's in memes. So when someone takes, 60s Spider-Man and then put something on there that's related to current events, or they're basically saying that the current event that they were commenting on is analogous to the feeling they get, or the expression on Spider-Man's that he has. People are implicitly doing this. They're saying, that expression there matches this particular situation or my emotions. And memes get very meta about this, but basically they're like speedy analogy formation. A lot of them, not all. Like obviously there's surreal nonsense also, but humor is a great way to kind of discover one's own analogy making, because when people are engaging in wordplay and puns and things like that, they're kind of already operating at the level of like searching their associative network. They're like, well, this person used this word, but that also reminds me of bananas, which reminds me of banana peels and a clown slipping on a banana peel. So that associative process with a little more structure, you go from just images relating to each other to images resonating with each other. And it comes naturally to people. So it's just a matter of drawing attention to what they already do a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And I think, as we're talking and I'm sort of, stewing on this, I think probably to some degree it comes from what we were talking about earlier, is people's fear of appearing silly, people's fear of not being concrete enough, right? It's a funny thing about the abstract in general, where people are like pretty uncomfy with abstract reasoning, abstract ideas, abstract thought, and it's
Right.
it's so often compared to silliness or I can't think of the word I want to use, but it basically means silliness, but is a less silly
Like being
version.
frivolous or something.
Frivolous.
Yeah. So, but there's an interesting sort of counterpoint. I mean, what you're saying is true, but there's an interesting counterpoint. And of all people, the philosopher Hegel made this point in an essay about how many uneducated or less educated people think in abstractions. And he gave a really interesting example of, I think those days they still had public executions.
Okay.
And there was some case of a murderer and some aristocratic educated woman was talking about how handsome the murderer was. And some of the poorer people were just horrified, and that she would think of that. And Hegel's point is that the average person who's horrified is thinking in terms of the abstraction. Murder equals evil. Evil means how could you think possibly about what that person looks like?
Yeah.
Whereas this other person is actually more concrete, because all they're thinking about is what's in front of them, which is a pretty face.
Yeah.
So you could say that some people, and it doesn't have to be educated or uneducated, it just like happens that a lot of people approach the world in terms of sort of large categories, which are abstract. They're like good or bad, what's in it for me, and like all those are in a sense abstractions, or like judging people by where they are from or what their background is, or how much money they make. These are all outside of the concrete of what they're experiencing with their senses.
Well, and what's sorry.
Yeah. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say what's really interesting too is that they're kind of shortcuts. These particular abstractions that you've mentioned, where it's like, like if I decide that everybody from X places is this way, then I don't have to get to know anybody and investigate further. Or if I decide that anybody who's killed another person is bad, I don't have to figure out if there was something that led to that, or if we're having some societal issue that's causing all these murderers or whatever. It's just a shortcut, which is really interesting because I never thought of it that way before. So
yeah, it's like we all look at the world through filters, and partly stress and like lack of free time, and poverty. Many things will force you to kind of simplify things, because it's like if you have no time at all, then you're like, oh, I need to only do the stuff that's super valuable. And that really simplifies things. Or if you've only given yourself 1 hour a day to watch TV, then you need to pack a wallop of as much entertainment as possible into that 1 hour. And it may, for someone who spends 8 hours a day watching TV, they have all these fine subtleties of the difference between TV show A and the remake or something like that, which other people don't have time for. They want like in India, we have this term masala movie, which means a mix of everything. A lot of the happiness, sadness, the action, everything dialed to 11.
Well, and I think that's a really interesting point, and something that honestly I've been thinking about a lot, and I would love your kind of thoughts on this. Is, okay, I don't know if you ever watched the show The Good Place. I don't watch a lot of TV, but it was one that I managed, and they talked about how complicated things have gotten, whether you talk about ethically or just responsibility wise, is that an adult human in 2021 has a billion things to manage. We have to manage all of our internet stuff, which is kind of a world of its own. And then on top of that, our jobs. And then on top of that, this and that and this and that. And even like, buying an apple could, if you followed the path, be child slavery in a different country, that kind of stuff. And it's gotten so complicated. So, I mean, I think that there's a lot of value in taking these shortcuts, maybe not those ones in particular, but in giving ourselves grace to just exist sometimes.
Right. There's no doubt that we need these. I mean, you'd go crazy if you were really only dealing with hyper-specific things and taking everything on face value. So it's you definitely need to simplify. But I guess you could say that it's, to go back to the musical analogy, that one needs to find the rhythm, like and somewhere in your the rhythm of your day, being able to sort of space out, think either very metaphorically or very literally. Because I often think that thinking very literally is also difficult. And a place to do this is in an art museum. Because a lot of people think when they're in an art museum that you're supposed to think of fancy theories of aesthetics and, what is the symbolic meaning? But I would recommend that. I mean, you can do that. You can read those little plaques that say very strange things about the painting. But you could also just think about paint. I love to go up to paintings and then look at them from the side and see the sheer quantity of paint that was used. Or think about, or just experience the physical form of the artwork, just color and texture and shape. And not think too much about what it means. If what it means comes screaming at you, then that's fine. But allocating space for that, and having hobbies. It could be cooking, it could be music, it could be pottery. Those are places where you can really get up close and personal with the literal of what's right in front of you.
So I have a question, and maybe you don't have an answer, and it's fine if you don't. But as you're talking about the art museum, so that's something that I do as well for whatever reason. So I'm really metaphorical, but I'm also an artist. So whenever I go to an art museum, I'm just fascinated with the paint and the form and how they did all that. But the other thing, so I almost never think about what it means, almost never. But sometimes what'll happen is I'll be overcome with a feeling, whatever that feeling might be. Maybe it's a really suddenly I feel really dark, or I feel really happy, or whatever, light. There's all sorts of different feelings that I might feel, which 2 of the 3 of those were metaphors. But in those cases, feeling your feelings, would that fall more into the abstract, or would that fall more into the literal, because it's a physical sensation, right?
That is a great question, and I could go either way with this. But I think what I'll say is maybe not exactly an answer, but it's something like this. After I wrote that essay, and I've been thinking about in the past couple of years, I've been thinking that empathy is sort of like metaphor or analogy at the level of emotion. Ooh. So when you experience feelings, particularly if you're watching something and then it's oh, that thing exactly happened to me, and I relate. That's one thing. And that relating, it has an autobiographical quality. Mm-hmm. But in ancient Indian aesthetics, which I discovered a couple of years ago, there was this idea that, well, if you can't relate at all, then and you still feel the emotion, then that's very pure in some sense. So in those examples, it was let's say you're watching a play about a king, and you're not a king. There's only one king, so you're probably not the king. And you're watching, and the king is sad, and over the course of the play, you feel sad too. And let's say the situation is so out of this world that it's never happened to you. Yeah. The sadness that you experience is in one sense very abstract, because it is abstracted from your life. Mm-hmm. It's not oh, that happened to me just the other day. But at the same time, there's something very concrete in the sense that you're not merely thinking about sadness, you're experiencing it. Exactly. Or a version of it. So it kind of blurs that boundary between the abstract and the concrete. You're concretely feeling something, but there is a process of abstraction. And in fact, you could flip it around and say that to really kind of have that suspension of disbelief and to forget about yourself and be completely wrapped in something. On the one hand, you need to be willing for that to happen. But on the other hand, that's the skill of the artist, to kind of make you forget almost who you are even for the duration of the movie or the TV show. Yeah, that totally makes sense. So how it happens is very abstract, but the actual experience of it is very concrete. Oh, that's so cool. Okay, so we're going to move on to our super fun game. But before we do that, can you just remind people where they can find your work? I know you've got a website and some other cool stuff. Yeah, you can Yohan John, YOHANJOHN.com, and I'm on Twitter, Dr Yohan John, Dr Yohan John. Yeah, and honestly, if you follow anyone on Twitter, follow Dr. Yohan John. He posts the most interesting stuff. I often don't respond because it's a bit above me. I feel if I respond, I'm going to look silly in front of all these neuroscientists. But I read them all, and it's fascinating. And so I definitely recommend following Dr. Yohan. Feel free to respond. It's my job to come up with analogies to make these things understandable, if they're not. Oh, like I said, I love it. I love reading it. And then I always feel so smart because I understand. I just don't quite understand well enough to respond in a way that's going to add value. So I just press the little heart and enjoy it and move on. But so like I said, definitely worth a follow. Definitely recommend. So you ready to guess some super fun Gen Z slang? Sounds good. All right. So we'll start with bop. What does it mean
to say something is a bop?
Catchy song?
Yes, that is exactly what it is. This song's a bop. Okay, what does bet mean?
Is what?
Bet.
Bet?
E-E-T. And it doesn't mean like gamble or wager.
No. Bet. A guess? I don't know.
Yeah, it means yes, yeah. Is that what you guessed? Yes?
I said guess.
Oh. Well, yeah, so it means like it's just a general term for agreement. So if I was like, "Hey, are you going to come on my podcast today?" You'd be like, "Bet."
Oh, like I'll bet. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, that's probably where it comes from.
Uh-huh.
Oh, or you bet. I didn't even know. I was just like, that's a weird
You
saying.
bet. Yeah.
Okay, what does it mean to say cap or no cap?
The whole thing is one phrase, cap or no cap?
No. You can say either. So there's cap and its opposite, no cap.
Cap or no cap? Oh, that's a weird one.
Yeah, it's super weird and I don't understand where it came from at all.
Something to do with clothes?
No, it's lying. So cap means to lie. So if I was like, I'm having Dr. Yohan John on today and people be like, is that cap? And I'd be like, no cap. I don't know why I keep using this. This is an example. But, all right, we'll do two more. This one's super, super weird to me. Drip.
Drip.
And it's not an onomatopoeia. It's so weird.
So to be sad?
No, right? Like that would make so much more sense. Apparently it means a cool sense of style. The example is her drip is iconic. So
Wow.
we'll use the last one. This will be the last one, and I'm pretty sure you know what it means, but maybe not. What does it mean to say that someone has ghosted?
Oh, they pieced out. They left.
Yeah, they disappeared without saying anything. You did fantastic. Yeah. You got 2 out of 5, which is significantly better than most people do. Thank you so much for joining me today. Is there anything you want to add before I say goodbye to the audience?
Thanks so much, Kara. It's always great. And people, if they want to chat more, feel free to contact me. Again, this was great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on. I just always enjoy talking to you. And to my audience, I love you. Bye.